for them. That is faithfulness to Christ, to serve and love the people by any means necessary.
Wow. So thank you so much, Comrade Haysung for sending in that video. I know you were here in the chat earlier, just checking to see. No. Okay, cool. So I just want to say that I personally appreciate that panel and the perspective a lot of Jesus as a radical social activist, as someone who grew up in the church, specifically the Black church, and recognized the impact that liberation theology has had in the progress of Black struggle. Thank you. The text says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son." So to think and to remember and reflect on the fact that Christianity has kind of been hijacked by a far-right conservative movement that also is aligned with nationalism, just kind of further shows the contradiction of the narrative of Christ in the American project. Jesus was crucified literally for protesting against the government. So to really be a follower of Christ and a follower of Jesus's love and his teaching, you have to be among the masses because that's where Christ was. So again, Haysung, thank you so much for that presentation, and for everybody still following. I just want you to remember we did have a bit of a schedule mishap, so we rearranged these two panels. We are also streaming live on Facebook, so if you need to, you can rewind and just kind of catch up with the live programming, just kind of however you need. Then, of course, we will be re-releasing this on the Rev School website when we debut it after this panel. So that was Revolutionary Spirituality with Comrade Haysung, and then now we're going to move to Fanon and the Algerian liberation struggle with Comrade Morgan. So feel free to come on in.
Hey y'all, can you hear me? Cool. All right, hey everybody. So I'm Morgan, and I work with the PSL in the Party for Socialism and Liberation, like comrades, Jeremiah and Cole and Basil. And today I'm here to talk about Frantz Fanon and the Algerian liberation struggle and Wretched of the Earth and Battle of Algiers, and a lot of specific topics that all go together. So Frantz Fanon himself was a Pan-Africanist existentialist philosopher. He was a psychiatrist, and he wrote a number of books, including Black Skin, White Masks, about the psychology of colonialism and racism, and Wretched of the Earth, which is a book that we'll kind of get into. Yeah, he was born 20 July 1925 in Martinique, which was a French colony in the Eastern Caribbean. It's north of St. Lucia. Martinique was occupied by the Vichy government when Fanon was 15. And for those of y'all who don't know, that was like the collaborating, or the French government that collaborated with the Nazis when the Nazis were like occupying France. And so that even extended to the French colony in the Caribbean of Martinique. And so Fanon got to see firsthand not just the inherent violence of colonialism as he was growing up, but even the most extreme version of that with, like Nazi and Nazi collaborationist governments. So yeah, once he was old enough to fight, he fled to Europe to go fight the Nazis. After the war, he was sent by the French to Algeria in 1953. He worked in a hospital, and there he got to treat. So basically, I'll get into the background of the Algerian independence struggle and Algerian colonialism in just a minute. But while he was there, basically the Algerian independence struggle was already going on, and the French were torturing Algerian revolutionaries. And as a psychiatrist, Fanon, worked with both the torturers, the French torturers, the settlers, and their victims, the Algerian people who were tortured by them. And so he, as far as both sides goes, he got to see the effect of this brutal colonization on both groups of people, and how it was dehumanizing to both the people that were being colonized and the people that were doing the colonizing. So given that he saw that firsthand, he switched sides and joined the FLN, which was the National Front for Liberation. He was kicked out of Algeria in 1957, and to skip ahead a few years, he died only 4 years later after that, in 6 December 1961. So Wretched of the Earth, a text I mentioned earlier, is kind of his magnum opus. It was the last thing he wrote. It was really a collection of 6 essays, and it was based on his experiences fighting with the FLN, and just his experiences of growing up under colonialism in Martinique and then seeing it in Algeria, and fighting alongside the Algerian people to overthrow the French. I feel like it's also important to note that the name of Wretched of the Earth comes from some of y'all might already know the song, but the International. It's a song that was written by the anarchist Eugene Potier in 1871 after the fall of the Paris Commune. So basically, the Paris Commune is a huge historical event for the history of the working class. It was the first time one of the first times that the working class, and specifically the people of Paris, rose up and took control of the government. And it was an attempt, it was an experience that Marx and Lenin and all of the the Marxist authors, and even a lot of the anarchist authors like Bakunin based a lot of their theories on, was what happened in the commune. But anyway, Eugene Potier escaped, was able to survive after the commune fell, and he wrote the song "The International" the same year, and it's used by anarchists and socialists and communists and all kinds of leftists around the world as kind of a unifying anthem. It's very moving, and it's it's basically it's the official anthem of basically every communist party around the world. It was the first anthem of the Soviet Union. But there's the line, "Arise, you wretched of the earth." "Arise, you workers of all nations. Arise, you wretched of the earth." And that's what he named his final book after. So basically, let's look at the wider global context Wretched of the Earth was written in. So it was written in a moment of intense decolonization around the world, but specifically in Africa. So at that time, the settler state of Rhodesia was in the process of being overthrown. It wouldn't be until the 80s that it actually, that war was over, and the nation that we now call Zimbabwe would be born. But that was going on. Angola, Libya were all getting independence. African nations all over the continent were were getting free. But it was also happening in like Vietnam. It was happening at the same time. So yeah, speaking of which, Algeria itself is in Northwest Africa. It was colonized by the French in 1830, and it was fully part of France. Like it wasn't, they didn't officially call it a colony. It was like just another department, like another division of France. But like everybody knows, it was a colony. To contrast, Martinique, where Fanon was born and raised, was considered an overseas territorial collectivity. And I think it's really significant to point out that whatever terms they use, like whatever the legal jargon is, like a colony is a colony is a colony. And the same thing applies today with, places like, yeah, exactly. Comrade Basil just pointed out in the chat, Puerto Rico and Guam and Hawaii, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and so many other places like Hawaii. Hawaii is a state, but we also just straight up overthrew their government and, invaded and took over, forced it to become a state. So it's colonialism is, it's a colony is a colony. But yeah. In any case, to tie it back to Vietnam, in 1954, the FLN founded. The FLN was founded. That's the National Liberation Front of Algeria, and they were founded specifically in 1954 after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which some of y'all might already know, is when the Viet Cong kicked out the French Empire. Indochina was like part of the French Empire, and the Viet Cong, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, kicked them out, and Dien Bien Phu was the big victory. And it was inspiring to people around the world who were colonized, and specifically people who were colonized by the French. There's that kind of international aspect of the struggle again. It's not just one specific place. Like, it's easy to read about the Algerian liberation struggle, but they saw them, we can see them as part of this global movement of decolonization, and they saw themselves within that too. It's also kind of an issue of playing whack-a-mole. The French Empire might be easy for them to swipe down one resistance movement in one country, one corner of their empire. But if you've got, if the people over in Africa see that the people over in Indochina are rebelling, they can seize upon that opportunity to also resist and rebel and revolt. Basically, that was when, 1954 is when the Algerian liberation struggle began. They saw very soon that they were outgunned by the French. They recognized that they didn't have the capability to meet them like in, a battle on open fields and all that. So they switched over to urban guerrilla warfare tactics. Now they eventually moved to terrorism, and launched a series of a bombing campaign, a series of bombings in the capital city of Algiers. So the French cracked down on this brutally and committed a whole bunch of atrocities, murdered a lot of civilians, and eventually won the battle. Like, the French won the Battle of Algiers in 1957, militarily anyway. But because they had committed so many, like, just brutal atrocities, such a visible crackdown on the people of Algeria and of Algiers specifically, there was an international, like, condemnation. The rest of the world, there had always been, and within colonialism, there's always this narrative of, that the people that, the colonized people, don't mind us being here, or it's, they're really happy, they don't, this whole idea of the colonial regime as being like a civilizing effort, or as being, peaceful, and, oh, we're bringing civilization or democracy or Christianity or whatever. But the fact that they had to, like, murder all of these people in Algiers proved to the people of Algeria and to the people back home in France, and to people around the world that know colonialism is very obviously based in just brutal, horrific violence. So basically, the countries of the world, including the U.S., interestingly enough, pressured France to sign the Evian Accords, which gave Algeria their independence in 1962. So yeah, one interesting, or not really interesting, but one really important and significant thing about this struggle is there is this organization called the OAS, which stands for Secret Armed Organization. You might notice some of these letters, like with FLN and OAS, are switched up. That's because we're getting the English translations. The abbreviations are in French, and I don't really speak French, so yeah. But anyway, so this organization, the OAS, was formed in 1961 in Franco's Spain, in fascist Spain, and it was an organization of settlers. Like one part of the colonization of Algeria was all of these, thousands of white French people moving into basically gentrifying Algeria, but on a national scale. This is a North African country, with Arab and, Bedouin natives who were being kicked out of their land. It was very, the capital city of Algiers was very segregated. So you had the Arab quarter and you had the French quarter, and they were kept, very, very separate. And we'll kind of get into that, and I'm going to read a little section from Wretched of the Earth, and he kind of gets into that. But this group specifically, the OAS, was a settler paramilitary organization. They were founded specifically to keep Algeria from getting independence, and they were opposing Algerian independence. They were opposed, they were violently opposed to the natives, but they were also basically viewed the state as being too, the French state as being too weak on Algeria. I mean, at one point, a number of times they actually attempted to assassinate the French president, de Gaulle. So the reason I bring all this up is it kind of gets into this notion that I think is really relevant today. So we've got this three-way fight going on. Specifically, there's a zine written by an anarchist that's called Three-Way Fight, Revolutionary Anti-Fascism and Armed Self-Defense by Jay Clark. And it's basically proposes this idea that we tend, as revolutionaries, we tend to look at ourselves as just okay, we've got us versus the state, the left versus the state. But really, it's more of a three-way fight. So at least here in this settler colonial context, so it's really the insurgent left versus the insurgent right versus the state. That in Algeria specifically, you've got the the FLN versus the OAS versus the French government. And in sometimes it was the OAS. Which was also made up of a lot of officers, French military officers. So the OAS and the French government sometimes would work together, would collaborate against the NLF. But then sometimes when the far right didn't see the government as being hard enough on the liberation struggle, they would attack the state. And so, for instance, attempting to assassinate the French president. And I think that's really, really relevant today when we look at what's going on with say the alt-right, with these with the pigs, the cops, and with fascist and neo-fascist paramilitary groups and militias. So specifically, I've got an example from this this zine, three-way fight. But it's really, really I hadn't noticed it until I went back to read through it in preparing for this presentation. But it's kind of, there's a quote that like history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And that really applies here. So basically, after Hurricane Katrina in NOLA and New Orleans, there's a neighborhood. Some of y'all that are familiar with the city, probably more familiar than me. There's this neighborhood called Algiers Point. That's a small, like, wealthy white neighborhood, and it's got Algiers. Like, there's another neighborhood, Algiers and one called West Bank, that are both predominantly like poor and black, and that are much larger than Algiers Point. And so after Hurricane Katrina, basically a bunch of like white militias, racist white militias formed in Algiers Point because they were scared of all the black people, and felt like, oh, it's the same stuff we hear today, the same dialogue. Oh, they're gonna come to our suburb and take everything and all that. And so they basically formed these basically fascist paramilitary groups of white men driving around in the back of pickup trucks, hunting black people, like shooting black people. I'm sorry, I should have done some sort of content warning for that, but basically they were just shooting black people in the street. And that continued until a former Black Panther from Algiers, from the neighborhood of Algiers, named Malik Rahim, basically, along with a bunch of anarchists, sat out on his porch with guns and waited for this militia group to drive by. And they had an armed standoff. Nobody died. Nobody was seriously injured in this standoff, but basically it took them standing up with weapons. They were being met with violence by these fascist paramilitaries, by these white militias, and these white militias would continue to inflict violence on the black community there until the black communities showed up with weapons, and then the white militias tucked tail and ran because they're cowards, and like Mao said, all reactionaries are paper tigers. They're more than willing to shoot unarmed people, but they couldn't handle someone defending themselves or defending their community. So I feel like that's really, really significant because here we got literally another example of this white settler enclave forming its own paramilitary groups separate from the state to attack colonized peoples. So with this idea of a three-way fight, modern day, we've got, obviously us on the left, revolutionaries, with all sorts of organizations, whether it's mutual aid disaster relief, the PSL, the Panthers, various groups, there are a lot of us. But then the insurgent right, we've got like 3%ers, the folks that were at the Bundy standoff, various militia groups like the Oath Keepers, even really super duper scary groups like Adam Wathan or the Klan. But yeah, anyway, so three-way fight, I highly recommend reading it. It's by Jay Clark. So moving on, so Wretched of the Earth inspired the Black Panthers, here in the U.S., the Provisional IRA in Northern Ireland and Ulster, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, all sorts of liberation struggles around the world. So there's that international aspect to struggle again. There's a movie that was made about the Battle of Algiers that shares a lot of themes with the book Wretched of the Earth, and it was made in 1966, which is only 4 years after Algerian independence and 9 years after the real battle. And it's called, the Battle of Algiers. It was filmed on site with actors who were like real normal people who were locals who like had lived through this struggle. A lot of times people think it contains like film footage because of the way it's shot. It doesn't. It's just all of these people like know what actually happened there, what they lived through. So the director, Pontecorvo, was an Italian communist, and this film, highly recommended. It inspired a lot of the same groups that were inspired by Wretched of the Earth, the Black Panthers, the Provos or the IRA, the PLO, and whatnot. It's also used for insurgency and counterinsurgency education, like here in the U.S., around the world, but specifically during the U.S. invasion of Iraq. They use that, as a way of teaching, the U.S. military, like service members who are going to be going over there, like how to root out an insurgency, how to do counterinsurgency. But it's also used by insurgent groups like the IRA or the PLO to teach them how to successfully, have an insurgency. It's like, seriously, go watch it. It's very much worthwhile. Because what we're seeing right now, like on the streets, what we're seeing right now with the way that, the way that propaganda is being used to show the cops as, like say what happened here in town with, where the cops, at this protest took a knee with everyone, and a whole bunch of photos were taken of it and that sort of thing. A lot of that stuff is part of a counterinsurgency tactic. But yeah, anyway, to wrap this thing up, I figured I would read some of Wretched of the Earth. So it's story time, and kind of let Fanon speak for himself, because this book is gunpowder. I think y'all really enjoy it. Let's check, make sure. All right. So to start off, I'm going to be reading from mostly just from the first section of the book, which is on violence or concerning violence. It's the most famous part of the book. The book itself isn't like, it's not a single narrative. It's a series of like 6 essays that were compiled together. And so they each kind of get, they each kind of circle around the same themes, but they're each like about a different specific topic. Anyway, yeah. So the colonial world is cut in two. The dividing line, the frontiers, are shown by barracks and police stations. In the colonies, it is the policeman and the soldier who are the official instituted go-betweens, the spokesman of the settler and his rule of oppression. In capitalist societies, the educational system, whether lay or clerical, the structure of moral reflexes handed down from father to son, the exemplary honesty of workers who are given a medal after 50 years of good and loyal service, and the affection which springs from harmonious relations and good behavior. All these aesthetic expressions of respect for the established order serve to create around the exploited person an atmosphere of submission and of inhibition, which lightens the task of policing considerably. In the capitalist countries, a multitude of moral teachers, counselors, and bewilderers separate the exploited from those in power. In the colonial countries, on the contrary, the policeman and the soldier, by their immediate presence and their frequent and direct action, maintain contact with the native and advise him by means of rifle butts and napalm not to budge. It is obvious here that the agents of government speak the language of pure force. The intermediary does not lighten the oppression, nor seek to hide the domination. He shows them up and puts them into practice with clear conscience of an upholder of the peace. Yet he is the bringer of violence into the home and into the mind of the native. The zone where the native live is not complementary to the zone inhabited by the settlers. The two zones are opposed, but not in the service of higher unity. Obedient to the rules of pure Aristotelian logic, they both follow the principle of reciprocal exclusivity. No conciliation is possible. For the two terms, one is superfluous. The settler's town is a strongly built town, all made of stone and steel. It is a brightly lit town. The streets are covered with asphalt, and the garbage cans swallow all the leavings, unseen, unknown, and hardly thought about. The settler's feet are never visible, except perhaps in the sea, but there you're never close enough to see them. His feet are protected by strong shoes, although the streets of his town are clean and even, with no holes or stones. The settler's town is well-fed, an easy-going town. Its belly is always full of good things. The settler's town is a town of white people, of foreigners. The town belonging to the colonized people, or at least the native town, the village, the medina, the reservation, is a place of ill fame, peopled by men of evil repute. They are born there. It matters little where or how. They die there. It matters not where or how. It is a world without spaciousness. Men live there on top of each other, and their huts are built one on top of the other. The native town is a hungry town, starved of bread, of meat, of shoes, of coal, of light. So yeah, again, not really going to provide commentary on this. I'll just let it speak to itself, or speak for itself, because I feel like it's really, I feel like it really does speak for itself. The settler makes history and is conscious of making it. And because he constantly refers to the history of his mother country, he clearly indicates that he himself is the extension of that mother country. Thus, the history which he writes is not the history of the country which he plunders, but the history of his own nation in regard to all that she skims off, all that she violates and starves. The immobility to which the native is condemned can only be called into question if the native decides to put an end to the history of colonization, the history of pillage, and to bring into existence a history of the nation, the history of decolonization. A world divided into compartments, a motionless, manichaeistic world, a world of statues. The statue of the general who carried out the conquest, the statue of the engineer who built the bridge, a world which is sure of itself, which crushes with its stones the backs flayed by whips. This is the colonial world. The native is a being hemmed in. Apartheid is simply one form of the division into compartments of the colonial world. The peasantry is systematically disregarded for the most part by the propaganda put out by the nationalist parties, and it is clear that in the colonial countries, the peasants alone are revolutionary, for they have nothing to lose and everything to gain. The starting peasant outside the class system is the first among the exploited to discover that only violence pays. For him there is no compromise, no possible coming to terms. Colonization and decolonization are simply a question of relative strength. The exploited man sees that his liberation implies the use of all means, and first and foremost, of violence. At the decisive moment, the colonialist bourgeoisie, which up till then has remained inactive, comes into the field. It introduces that new idea which is, in proper parlance, a creation of the colonial situation, nonviolence. In its simplest form, this nonviolence signifies to the intellectual and economic elite of the colonized country that the bourgeoisie has the same interests as they, and that it is therefore urgent and indispensable to come to terms for the public good. Nonviolence is an attempt to settle the colonial problem around a green glazed table before any regrettable act has been performed or irreparable gesture made, before any blood has been shed. But if the masses, without waiting for the chairs to be arranged around the table, listen to their own voice and begin committing outrages and setting fire to buildings, the elite and the nationalist bourgeoisie parties will be seen rushing to the colonialists to exclaim, "This is very serious. We do not want to know how it will end. We must find a solution, some sort of compromise." Before negotiations have been set afoot, the majority of the nationalist parties confine themselves, for the most part, to explaining and excusing away the savagery. They do not assert that the people have to use physical force, and it sometimes even happens that they go so far as to condemn, in private, the spectacular deeds which are declared to be hateful by the press and public opinion in the mother country. The legitimate excuse for this ultra-conservative policy is the desire to see things in an objective light, but this traditional attitude of the native intellectual and of the leaders of the nationalist parties is not, in reality, in the least objective. For in fact, they are not at all convinced that this impatient violence of the masses is the most efficient means of defending their own interests. Moreover, there are some individuals who are convinced of its ineffectiveness of violence or of violent methods. For them, there is no doubt about it. Every attempt to break colonial oppression by force is a hopeless effort, an attempt at suicide, because in the innermost recess of their brains, the settlers' tanks and airplanes occupy a huge place. When they are told action must be taken, they see bombs raining down on them, armored cars coming at them on every path, machine gunning and police action. They stay quiet. They're beaten from the start. But the agitation which ensues, the coming and going, the listening to speeches, seeing the people assembled in one place, with the police all around, the military demonstrations, arrests, and the deportation of leaders, all this hubbub makes the people think that the moment has come for them to take action. In these times of instability in political parties, the political parties multiply their appeals to the left for calm, while on their right they scan the horizon, trying to make out the liberal intentions of colonialism. And I guess I don't want to get over time or anything, so I'll close with this one that ties it back to the international scope of the Algerian struggle, and specifically, the fact that their struggle began with them seeing the success of the struggle in Vietnam by the Viet Cong to overthrow the French. A colonized people is not alone. In spite of all that colonialism can do, its frontiers remain open to new ideas and echoes from the world outside. It discovers that violence is in the atmosphere, that it here and there bursts out, and here and there sweeps away the colonial regime. That same violence which fulfills for the native a role that is not simply informatory, but also operative. The great victory of the Vietnamese people at Dien Bien Phu is no longer, strictly speaking, a Vietnamese victory. Since July 1954, the question which the colonized peoples have asked themselves has been, what must be done to bring about another Dien Bien Phu? How can we manage it? Not a single colonized individual could ever again doubt the possibility of a Dien Bien Phu. The only problem was how best to use the forces at their disposal, how to organize them, and when to bring them into action. All right, let's see if got any questions.
There's a question in the question and answer chat. Someone asked, in those films, do we know if there were any notable negative mental or economic impacts on the locals involved in its creation?
I'm sorry, okay, sorry, I see it. Okay, so in those films, do we know if there was any, or if there were any notable negative mental or economic impacts on the locals involved in its creation? And then, let's see. Okay. So as far as I'm aware, there weren't with the filming. I'm assuming you mean like the filming of Battle of Algiers. I wasn't able to find anything like that. There might be. I definitely would have to do more research on it. I know that it was banned in France, like immediately, and it was very controversial there. Even after it was released. I also, I feel like kind of getting to, this isn't exactly answering your question, but I feel like it's brought up by your question. It's very easy in talking about all this to, when you talk about revolution, it's very inspiring, but I don't want to gloss over that this was a war. This revolution is messy and violent and brutal, and it's a war. And there were, within the Algerian struggle, there were atrocities committed, on both sides. We talked about the bombing. The NLF had a bombing campaign, in Algiers. that targeted specifically, this is a very segregated city, targeted the French Quarter, and French civilians who were, settlers, were killed. But then also, the OAS, and the way that the French state cracked down, it's one of those things, and I think that's why the movie Battle of Algiers is so important, and why Ratchet of the Earth is so important. And Fanon's analysis overall is that violence shouldn't, violence is inherent to colonialism, that it is something that, colonialism is maintained through brutal, horrific violence. And some people see it more than others. Some people are more, are kept away from it. A lot of like settlers, are prevented from seeing its direct effects, or made to not care if they are, they do see it. But the only way to get rid of that, is with violence, to meet that with violence. But that also that any sort of threat to colonialism will be met with more violence. So don't want to shy away from that it, will be met with state repression, with, guns and prisons and, all of that. And that was definitely very, very true in Algeria. That was one reason that they ultimately got their independence, was because, this, the brutality of the French regime was exposed. Yeah. Did anybody have any other questions or anything? All right. Then I guess I will hand it over back to DT.
There we go. Awesome. Thanks again, Morgan. Let's make sure I can see myself and not our artwork. Awesome, Morgan. Thanks again for that presentation. Super enlightening, super helpful. And also, it's always good to be reminiscent of, again, the international struggle for revolution, right? For a true proletarian revolution across the globe. In fact, very recently on one of the podcasts in the Rebel Media Group Network, Baked Beans and Rice, we did an episode with Dash Harris, who's the founder of Afro Latinx Travels. And we talked about how colonialism and imperialism directly play a part in the struggle for Black liberation across the globe. And how, as Black Americans specifically, we have a responsibility as people who have kind of